The G20 summit is happening in India this year. The G20 summit is one of the most important international gatherings that happens annually. This year's G20 president is India. The summit is going to be held on the 9th and 10th of September under the theme Vasudev Kutumbakam, which means one earth, one family, one future. Now, before we dive deep into the details of the summit that is going to take place on the 9th and 10th of September in New Delhi, let us understand what G20 is, its history, and how it was formed. So, G20 is a group of 20 of the most powerful economies in the world. To be specific, 19 countries and the European Union. G20 as a group focuses on a range of issues from finance, economics to climate, health, and technology. Its main focus still remains financial and economic cooperation among these member countries. G20 is an informal group of these countries that come together every single year and discuss on the agendas that I talked about earlier. It is not a formal organization and hence it does not have a headquarter. So the country that is the president for a year is the host of the events and also is responsible for setting up the agenda for that particular year. The G20 or Group of 20 was formed in the year 1999 when the finance ministers and central bank governors of 7 of the most powerful countries in the world met and decided to include 20 of the most powerful economies of the world. This move came after the financial crisis of 1997, which is also known as the Asian financial crisis, which first began in Thailand and then spread throughout Asia. So much so that the group of the 7 largest economies in the world, which were also the developed economies of the world, were affected by the consequences of this crisis. As I mentioned, G7 is a group of 7 developed economies of the world, 7 of the largest economies of the world, whereas G20 is a group of both developed and developing economies of the world. Members of G7 countries are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, and USA. And the reason for the creation of G20 was because G7, as I mentioned earlier, was a group that was made up of all developed economies or developed nations of the world, and the crisis that took place in 1997 majorly affected developing economies at that point of time. It spread out from developing economies and then impacted the world. In order to understand the conditions of the developing economies, they decided to include developing economies into this group because without the addition of developing economies, these developed countries could not understand the problems that were faced by these developing economies, and hence G20 came into existence. Now, let us talk about some facts. G20 represents almost 2/3 of the world's population with over 75% of the global trade and about 80% of the global GDP. Now, coming back to the concept of presidency, as I mentioned earlier, G20 is not a formal organization and hence it does not have any headquarters. So each year the presidency is given on a rotational basis. This year the president is India, last year it was Indonesia, and next year it's going to be Brazil. So the presidency for 3 consecutive years has been with developing economies. So when it comes to setting up the agendas and overseeing the work of G20 for a particular year, it is not just done by the current president but the past president or the president of last year as well as the president of the next year. And together, when all of these presidents of the past and the next year, they come together with the current president, this alliance is called Troika. So the current Troika is made up of Indonesia, India, and Brazil. All of them are developing economies. Now, to understand G20 in a better way, it is also important to understand 2 of the major tracks of G20, which are finance track and Sherpa track. The finance track includes all the finance ministers and central bank governors who discuss issues related to finance and economics, international finance and economics to be precise. Some of these issues are international corporate taxation, international debt, financial stability, and development finance. On the other hand, the Sherpa track looks after the agendas and oversees the working groups and also is responsible for the discussion of other range of agendas like climate change, health, food security, to name a few. Another important year in the history of G20 was 2008. Why was it important? It was important because of the global financial crisis. So the global financial crisis started in the US with a housing crisis, and then later on it spread out throughout the world. And it was at that moment wherein the heads of state, they decided to meet and conduct these gatherings, and from then on, every single year, heads of state meet at the G20 summit. So the G20 summit has evolved from a meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors to also the meetings of the heads of state of the member countries. Now, coming back to the presidency that has been given to India this year, the theme of this year, as I mentioned earlier, is Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. And it also makes 2023 an important year for India. Now, why is it important for India? Because at this point, all eyes from around the world are on India, and India has a chance to showcase its economic and diplomatic prowess. India, being the president of G20 this year, has the power to invite non-G20 members to the summit as well. This year, India has invited several of the non-G20 members to the summit. These include Bangladesh, Egypt, Netherlands, Nigeria, Mauritius, Singapore, Spain, Oman, and UAE. 9 non-members of G20 summit are going to attend as guests. Now, obviously, there are other international organizations that are also going to be a part of the G20 summit, including the IMF and WHO. Coming back to why the G20 summit is important for India. Now, India is one of the fastest growing economies and also the 5th largest economy in the world. But time and again, the international media has criticized India and shown it in a negative light. So this year, it really has a chance to come out and showcase the advancements that the country has made in the sectors of energy and technology, specifically fintech. So while the Western media does not highlight the advancements and improvements that are taking place in India, India can use the platform to show the world the progress, the kind of progress that it has made over the years. So the agenda this year, as tweeted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is inclusive, ambitious, decisive, and action-oriented. And the focus of working groups this year has been on climate finance, women empowerment, green development, inclusive growth, and public infrastructure. Another important reason for India's presidency this year is because of the extreme geopolitical and geo-economic issues that are taking place or that are surrounding the world. With the ongoing war in Russia and Ukraine, not only are we witnessing the immediate effects of the war in those two countries, but around the world as well. And developed nations like US and members of the European Union are in support of Ukraine in this war, and they have put sanctions on Russia. On the other hand, India and Russia have been allies for decades now, and the Western nations, they understand India's alliance with Russia. At the same time, India has put forward a neutral stance on this ongoing war. And although India has taken a neutral stance on this war, but Prime Minister Modi has said that this is not the century for war. So it will be interesting to see how India is going to navigate itself and take a stance during the summit. But I also believe that the neutral stance that India has taken, and also its friendship with the West as well as Russia, it is going to be an unbiased member and is going to act without favoring any of the two blocs. And at the same time, it has become clear to the world that India does not and will not get pressurized into taking a stance, especially by the Western nations. India's image as a leader has grown in the last few years, as India has taken some of the most important steps, which has increased its credibility at the international stage. Russia and Ukraine war has also caused food shortage around the world as well as energy crisis in the European continent. Food prices have particularly increased due to the ongoing war, and this is because both Russia and Ukraine are one of the largest grain producers in the world. So it will be interesting for us to witness as to how India positions itself in this particular matter. Yet another agenda that PM Modi has been constantly pushing is to bring about reforms in international bodies or international organizations like the International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, and World Bank, so that they can align better with the developing countries. Because it is important for those international organizations to understand what developing economies need and the kind of problems that they are facing right now, as they are heavily influenced by the developed nations. India also wants to present itself as an alternative to China. And the Western nations, they are heavily dependent on China for trade. India will also be positioning itself as to how it can work with the Western nations in this regard. China wants to replace the US as a global superpower, and the United States is very aware of this very fact. So it is also important for the United States to form an alliance based on trade with India, because it also knows India's position and understands that India could be a powerful ally. And in that context, India emerges as the next best alternative to China, as it not only has one of the most hardworking and talented populations around the world, but it has also emerged as a country that the West can rely upon. So, what do you think about the upcoming G20 summit? And what are some of the issues that you think are going to be talked about and discussed in the summit? Please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed watching this video, please share it with your friends and family. And please do remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.